Short on local water supplies and long on regulatory requirements? Do a deep dive with us by listening to the Full Circle podcast to learn how Las Virgenes Municipal Water District and the Triunfo Water Sanitation District are meeting 21st century water supply challenges for a portion of the Los Angeles and Ventura County regions.
Hello, and welcome to the Full Circle podcast, where we are discussing all things water in the Las Virgenes Conejo region, specifically our pure water project, Las Virgenes Triunfo, set to bring us a new local supply of water by 2028. Thank you for joining us again. If you were with us last time, we were waxing poetic about all things finance and money and numbers, and Don gave us some great context into how these projects get funded. Today is a very special day, and I'm very excited because we have my boss's boss, Joe McDermott, PE, MPA, who is our Engineering and External Affairs Director. And today we're going to be talking about our tertiary treated Title 22 recycled water and what's so special about this water, as it is our source water for the Pure Water Project, the water that we're starting with, and why this water is sort of a better candidate and why this project is a better candidate than, say, desalination. So there are so many thoughts on desal, and I know that it seems more intuitive for us to undergo a project like that because we have the ocean like 5 miles away or something, but we're going to get into why it's not as obvious of a choice as one may think. But first, Joe, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Riki. You said I was your boss's boss, but we all know that you're the real boss.
Don't make me blush. Thanks for joining us, Joe. Thank you for your willingness to participate in our podcast and coming to share your expertise in all things water. Before we get into today's topic, I kind of wanted to explore a little bit and have you talk about sort of your path to where you're at as director here at Las Virgenes, and how, per se, an engineer of 20 some odd years came to be also our external affairs director. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you kind of married the technical with the outreach and the soft skills and all of that in your career?
Yeah, certainly. Oh boy. I remember when I was really little, probably, 8 years old or something. And I remember playing in the backyard with, I had a hose and I made this little makeshift, kind of like a plank that came off of a raised planter. The raised planter had a lot of dirt in it, and I was tinkering around with, I would flood the planter, and then all this soil would go onto this like wood plank that I had propped up on the lawn area. And for some reason, it was just fascinating me how I would see all the little dirt particles kind of like accumulate on the dirt plank. And it was dirty water, but by the time it would cascade off of this wood plank, it was just clean water. And I don't know why I was doing that. I was kind of a quirky kid,
Was this like
maybe a little nerdy, but but I think the whole thing with just treating and moving water always fascinated me. Now, what's interesting is fast forward, when I went to school, my alma mater is Northridge, Cal State Northridge.
Nice.
So
shout out CSUN.
I went there so for my full time in college, and initially I don't know what happened. Initially, I was seeking to get an education in structural engineering, so skyscrapers, those sorts of things. I remember going downtown LA and just looking up at the skyscrapers, and I was very fascinated with that as well. And then there was a phase where I was interested in designing roller coasters.
Oh, nice.
And I think someone talked me out of pursuing that because there's just not a huge market in that area. So anyway, so going to Northridge, it just so happened they had a really good program that focused more on kind of water, the water end of civil engineering, and that's really what I ended up pursuing.
Wait, can we kick it back to that story
Sure.
from your childhood?
Sure.
Did you basically build like a makeshift water filter with that wood plank in the planter? Is that what I'm hearing?
It was a very, very primitive form of treatment, I guess you could say.
No, I say that it's funny because when I was little, I caught myself building like a makeshift roller coaster. I was
Uh-huh.
getting my little engineer on in my parents' garage, and I ended up putting a huge like dent in my dad's brand new Jaguar.
Oh,
And so that was the day I knew I was never going to be an engineer. 'Cause I had never seen my father that upset. And I was like, yeah, not for me. But I do know how to talk my head off. So
yeah.
here we are. So you got your undergrad in
I got my
engineering.
undergrad in engineering from Northridge. Really, the emphasis was on the environmental and water side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Their program was really good in that it was very, very broad, so I could pretty much go anywhere with the education I got there. I ended up working right out of school doing groundwater well designs for a company called Fugro West. And really started out as drafting up the plans, schematics, and etc. for groundwater wells, municipal wells. These are very large wells. Did that for 2 years. Ended up working for left that after getting some experience, and then worked for a special water district up in the Bay Area. Moved up there. Worked up there for 6 years for Alameda County Water District as a project engineer, doing all kinds of things for them in the water business. And then I ended up moving back down to Southern California where my family still resides. And I worked for the city of Ventura for about 15 or so years in the engineering department, public works, and then eventually, kept promoting up, and then I was the assistant general manager for the water department for about 3.5 years.
Oh, I didn't know you were AGM over there.
I was AGM for
Nice.
Ventura Water for about 3.5 years, and then I found myself here with Las Virgenes Municipal Water District, where I've been for a little over 5 years now. Now, my time at Ventura, at some point, I decided to go back to school and get my master's in public administration.
This was after your PE, right?
Yeah, long after.
Yeah.
I was getting to a point where doing all the technical stuff all the time just wasn't as exciting anymore, and
Who would have thunk it?
I gravitated more towards some of the softer skill sets that were deep down inside me somewhere. So the MPA program again went back to Northridge, and boy, had it changed in the 12 years since I got my bachelor's degree there. But pursued a master's, picked away at that for several years, and really the emphasis with that program was civic engagement.
Mm.
And so I learned a lot there, and it's just things just evolved, and I found this opening here with Las Virgenes that was at the time it was only really external affairs. Eventually, I was handed over the engineering division here after I was here for a few years, but I've loved it. I love doing customer service. I love legislative affairs. I love the communications and outreach piece. And then I still get to use some of my skills in the engineering side of things. So it's a little bit of an odd title to have.
Yeah, but you know what? I will say, shout out to our engineers here at Las Virgenes and the JPA as a whole. We have very well-rounded engineers who are both left-brained and right-brained, and we all benefit from that. And certainly Joe is a great example of that. So we're super excited to have you. Why don't we go ahead and dive in, because we have some interesting topics. So, last episode, as I mentioned, we talked a lot about the numbers and how these things get financed and what the financial, I guess, not economy, but the financial environment is and how it's favorable for us. So now let's talk about our source water, because this is a really important part of this project, and it's sort of the main reason why we're so eligible for a project like this in comparison to something like, say, Desal. Can you kind of give us a nice high-level overview of what exactly tertiary recycled water is and where it comes from?
Absolutely. So, and in speaking about the source water for our pure water project, really comes from our Tapia water reclamation facility, and that facility has been there for decades. It used to I believe it used to only be secondary, and we added
Mm-hmm.
the third or tertiary treatment, which is the filtration. That's the final step. So I'll just talk a little bit about the process at Tapia. You have primary treatment, which is more of a physical kind of separation of solids that are in wastewater that comes from homes and businesses. Um, I could get very technical, but just kind of breaking it down and simplifying it. So it's a physical process of separating those solids. Then you have a secondary treatment process, which is largely it's a biological
Mm-hmm.
process, and you have these organisms in the wastewater. They're microbes that help break down the solids and the nutrients that are in that wastewater. A lot of treatment wastewater treatment facilities, especially like right along the coast, if they're right next to the ocean, they may only do those two primary and secondary treatment and then
Right.
discharge into the ocean
Right.
through an outfall. So not right onto the beach, but it's through a pipe that's underwater and it comes out, several hundred feet at least from the shore.
So essentially, just kind of throwing that water away because most of these
Yes,
plants aren't ever using that water again or taking it back in the same way that we're planning on doing, right?
yes, absolutely. But there are also plants. A lot of plants now do have that tertiary treatment, and Tapia Water Reclamation has tertiary, which is a kind of a final step in
Mm-hmm.
in the wastewater treatment
Mm-hmm.
process. And that's when you take that water that's gone through those first treatment processes, and then you actually filter it through. It's usually just like a sand and a charcoal, granulated charcoal media
Right.
medium, and usually you have it just feeds through these beds of
The
charcoal and
layers.
sand, and it just filters out any remaining particulates.
So it sounds like it essentially these filters, anthracite filters, right? They
Hmm.
sort of act as aquifers,
Yeah.
right? So, we've talked about this in our past episodes, but we don't use our aquifers. They're basically inactive. We have the high TDS, the dissolved solids in there that just make our groundwater kind of icky. And so, what we do have in place of those are essentially these anthracite filters that mimic Mother Nature and mimic those aquifers and allow us to get that same similar filtration that we would get underground above ground. And so, those are tertiary filters. That's the tertiary process, I should say. That's what gets us this Title 22 water. Title 22, who's regulating this water?
Yeah, so Title 22. So there's really two state agencies that, with regards to the Title 22, the State Water Resources Control Board, and there's also the Regional Water Quality Control Boards that help to regulate this treated wastewater and how it's used and how it's discharged to the environment, etc. So they're both of those agencies have different roles, but the Title 22 to be Title 22 compliant, you really you got to have that tertiary treatment before you could take that water and put it into our purple pipe system to use it for irrigation, etc. Not for human consumption,
Right.
but for irrigation purposes. So that's one of the reasons why we have the tertiary treatment. Another reason why we have tertiary treatment and why some wastewater treatment plants, especially as I mentioned right along the coastline, is because we had to discharge to Malibu Creek, and you can't you really you can't just discharge secondary treated water to a body of water like that, like a
Right.
creek. So another reason why we had tertiary treatment added many years ago.
That makes sense. So, this tertiary treated Title 22 water, we've talked about this again a bit, but it's super clean. It's odorless, it's clear, it's safe for using to irrigate, obviously. Up until recently, it's been discharged into the creek, both for, disposal, but as well to keep the flows up in that creek, as Veronica mentioned in our earlier episodes. Um, so we use it for irrigation. We know that it's safe for that. We use it at public schools, parks, golf courses. Especially last year during the drought, I was getting a lot of questions from customers. Valid, definitely. Why can't we pipe this water to our customers' homes so that they can also use it to irrigate their spaces? Why do they have to use drinking water essentially to keep their lawns and their gardens green if we all know that the majority of water use occurs outside? Can you kind of explain that a little bit for those that are still interested?
Certainly. Maybe I'll back up a little bit. We were an early implementer of reclaimed water for irrigation purposes. Again, our purple pipe system. One of the first in the state. In 1971, we installed the first section of purple pipe along Las Virgenes Road. And in the late 70s, we've expanded it since. In the late 70s, we added a whole bunch of pipe to the eastern portion of our service area, so mainly Calabasas. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, we installed a lot of purple pipe in the western section of our service area. And so the system has expanded quite a bit. So during the drought, we did have, and by the way, the purple pipe system it's really was a great, it still is a great system to have, because the thought of putting drinking water just on your landscapes it's not really all that necessary, and this reclaimed tertiary treated water is perfectly fine for doing that.
Exactly.
So it makes a lot of sense. So during the drought, we did get quite a few customers inquiring about just connecting up with the purple pipe system, residential customers primarily, and a lot of that was they wanted to save their landscapes and their lawns from dying, etc.
Which is valid.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The problem is that we've expanded the system to the extent where in the summer now the available reclaimed water for irrigation purposes, it's oversubscribed. There is not enough water. In fact, we actually have to add drinking water, purely perfectly good drinking water, to the recycle water system, and we do that. At our reservoir 2. We just add in the summer when it's really hot. We have to start adding, and there's been times we've had to add 1 million plus gallons per day of perfectly good drinking water, so that people could keep their landscapes alive and green, etc. And so we're really at a point now where we actually have a policy in place to not expand the recycle water system any further. It's already oversubscribed in the summer. We do have excess in the winter, and that's the excess that we could use for the Pure Water project.
Right.
And again, that's because people aren't watering, customers aren't watering in the cooler months like they do in the summer. And so we're really just not making any more connections, especially to your smaller residential customers. There's the supply issue, as I just mentioned. The other issue is there's some genuine safety issues with the use of recycled water. And there's a lot of regulations around using recycled water on your property.
Yes.
You have to have a backflow prevention device that has to get tested every year. You have to have a person that's basically in charge of making sure that you don't have any accidental, I'll say quote unquote, accidental connections between the drinking water and the recycled water.
Right. There's a lot of compliance components.
We don't want anyone to get sick if they end up drinking too much of this recycled water, if it gets into the drinking water system.
Yeah.
So there's lots and lots of regulations, and for us, while it's possible, again, we have supply shortages in the summer. It also adds, it would require us to add additional staffing, and we're really trying to keep our rates as low as possible for our customers. So
it's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so all in all, there is a higher use available for this recycled water, so it doesn't make sense to invest the time, the money, staff resources into expanding our purple pipeline, in addition to the human health aspect and issues with recycled water getting into our drinking water line. So really, it was kind of a perfect match for what we were looking for. We needed a way to get out of Malibu Creek. We needed something to do with this excess recycled water that we have. And it just so happens that this source water, the quality of this tertiary treated Title 22 recycled water, is a perfect candidate for the advanced purification process, which will create a new local supply of water, which is supposed to, bring us up to 30% potentially of our drinking water supply. That's huge. That sounds perfect. It sounds like a great alternative. You're killing two birds with one stone. But that wasn't the only option that we were looking at during, the process following the TMDL. And of course, the topic of desal came up. And there are a lot of people that have a lot of opinions on desalination. It can be very effective in certain instances. They use it in other parts of the world. There are desal plants in other parts of California, but we do know that it is pretty difficult to get a desalination plant up off the ground in this state. And so let's get into that. Let's dive in. What's the deal with desal specifically in our region? And can we kind of get into why this wasn't prioritized over something like pure water, given our proximity to the ocean?
Certainly. So there was the stakeholder process that occurred actually before my time here at Las Virgenes, and there were a lot of different. So we had to get out of the creek, and we had to get out of the creek because the water that we're discharging, even though it's tertiary treated, it's chlorinated and dechlorinated. So it's actually, the water is, you could essentially gulp it and be fine. You don't want to you're probably not going to get sick, but again, you're not supposed to drink it.
Right.
And so this is water being discharged to the creek, and with regulations getting more and more stringent, and because the water does have some nutrients like nitrates and phosphorus in it that could exacerbate algal blooms in the creek and wreak havoc on the environment that way, upsetting the environment. So, we're basically getting kicked out of the creek,
right.
And we to continue discharging to the creek, it has to be treated to even higher than drinking water standards, right? Stripping out all of those nutrients that you will find those nutrients in drinking water. And so, yeah, if you need to treat it to above drinking water standards, why wouldn't you just drink it?
Right, exactly.
And you're getting out of the creek too at the same time. You're not discharging to the creek anymore. So that's where we're at. So the concept of desal, and this is what's always this is an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed. We could talk about potable reuse and our pure water project, and it always comes up. Well, why don't you guys just build desal?
Yeah.
Well,
like it's supposed to be the easier alternative.
Well, desal does absolutely nothing for us with regards to, addressing that discharge to the creek.
Yeah.
That does not one single thing.
Right.
We still have to do this project so that we're not discharging to the creek. And so, yeah, there are alternatives. There's just piping that tertiary treated water all the way down to Malibu and having an outfall in the ocean. That's very expensive to pursue.
Because you would have to get all new permitting for something like that too, right? And on that coastline, which is very highly protected.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, I'm a big advocate of finding win-wins and killing two birds with one stone.
Yes.
And so the beauty of this project is by building it and running it, our advanced water treatment facility, we're getting out of the creek. Okay, so we have to get out of the creek, otherwise huge fines associated with that if we're not out by the end of the 2030. But we all know that it's probably a good idea to have a diversified water supply portfolio, which we do not have.
Right.
We're state water project dependent. We all experienced that through this last drought and what that means. Huge allocations, being cut back on our water supplies from the state water project, and essentially everybody's lawns died, and so not really a good situation to be in the long run. So, but this project will help us diversify that water supply portfolio. There is a place for desal, not now. I think it's worth us studying and perhaps pursuing down the road at some point. It's a very long road for desal, but right now we got to get out of the creek, and lo and behold, the side benefit is the icing on the cake is we also get a little additional drinking water and help diversify our water supply portfolio for drinking water, which is great.
Great. Okay. So with desal, there are some similarities and some differences. Can you talk about how desal and the advanced purification process differ as far as like the technology?
Boy, they're almost identical. It's they really are. The biggest difference. So again, pure water or purified recycled water um, versus desalination, and it would be the same for like brackish water. So there's
Right.
sometimes you get a lot of salts in your groundwater, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like desal, but just the salt concentrations aren't as high. The technology is virtually the same. The biggest difference with desal is it requires, as far as the treatment process, it requires a lot more reverse osmosis units, and the reason for that is seawater desalination. The seawater itself has about 35,000 parts per million of salt
Mm-hmm.
salinity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and our wastewater, our tertiary treated water, has about 1,000 parts per million.
So way less salty. All that to say that it's way less salty
And
than ocean water.
it costs a lot of money. It takes more RO modules,
Right.
which there's a upfront capital cost for that. Once you add more RO modules, your building footprint increases. All your ancillary piping and pumps and everything just gets a lot bigger. So the upfront capital cost is a lot more for desal,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just something that we in the industry we're aware of, what trying to remove that much more salt.
Right.
It just gets a lot more expensive, but it's virtually the same treatment process.
Right, but for advanced purification, you have those RO filters that are part of a three-step process, right? And if
Mm-hmm.
you've been to the demo facility for tours, you've heard me talk ad nauseum about this. RO is a part of a three-step process when it comes to the advanced purification process. And you have a filtration process in ultrafiltration that helps to kind of take some of the load off those RO filters before the water goes through those. Now, in desal, you use all RO filters, correct? There is no step before?
Not necessarily. Typically, you do want to still like, call it pre-treat before you push the water through RO membranes.
Mm-hmm.
So you typically would still have some kind of a pre-treatment, either UF or MF,
Mm-hmm.
just to take the load off the RO membranes. But you would also still that third treatment step would be in our case UV,
Mm-hmm.
advanced oxidation, so ultraviolet light advanced oxidation for disinfection purposes. So very similar processes for desal versus purified recycled water.
So then it sounds like the biggest difference then really is the source water, right? So
Yeah.
that ocean water is filthy, but a lot more salty. And so it takes a lot more to push that water through those RO filters, or maybe not a lot more, but it's having to remove a lot more. And so that
Yeah.
ups the consumption of energy and the cost, as you touched on.
Yeah, and one thing to note, like for our pure water project, purified recycled water projects, you're you're gonna reclaim about 80 to 85%, and it varies depending on what kind of design you use for the process of that water. That water you bring through, like so 80-85% of the water you bring through, you'll be able to reclaim as drinking water,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to have about 10-15%, 15-20% waste. That's your brine that has to get discharged to the ocean. With desalination, it's more like 50%. So for every 1 gallon of drinkable water, you got to push 2 gallons through.
Oh,
So
wow.
you end up with a lot more of that waste product, that brine that
Mhm.
has to be returned back to the ocean.
Oh, wow. So not the most efficient
No,
with the water use.
no.
And we'll get to the brine disposal in a second. But first, we've talked about costs and we talked about, funding mechanisms for this project. But can we talk a little bit about the cost comparison between desal and pure water? Because that plays a pretty big part in why the pure water project is, kind of favored over something like desal. why is desal so expensive, and what are some of the challenges that come with the funding compared to pure water?
Certainly. So I think of costs broken down in kind of two categories. There's your upfront capital, construction costs, and the design and everything that goes into that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's your ongoing kind of operational costs. So for desal, for us to build desal, and again, we're really talking about down the road if we want to further augment and diversify our water supply portfolio. Um, the One of the biggest additional costs would be having an intake structure in the ocean. For us, it would be if we were to build our own small plant here or somewhere near our service area, having a intake structure out in the ocean. Malibu, probably not, probably a political uphill battle building something like that in Malibu.
Sure.
But there's a lot of complexity to what goes into that intake system, that pipe that sticks out into the ocean. You have to have a special screen, or you have to actually have a infiltration gallery, all these pipes that are kind of buried underneath the ocean sediment. So there's different ways you could bring water in, but that's a very that's one of the huge hurdles with desal is the cost associated with that. And then for us, it would be piping the water up all the way up through Malibu Canyon and getting it to a plant, or if we had a plant down there, it's just that additional pipe run would be a huge additional cost for us. So that's looking at the capital side. And then if I spoke about the additional RO membranes and,
Right.
and a larger building footprint, et cetera, for desalination. On the operational side, it's really the electricity demands, the energy requirement to desalinate, and it's reading various white papers, etc., studies. It's anywhere from 3 to 10 times the amount of energy for desalination versus purified recycled water. And again, that's because of the difference in salinity.
Right, in the source water.
The TDS salinity, seawater versus just wastewater, 35,000 parts per million versus 1,000 parts per million. It's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Huge energy requirements for that. And quite frankly, right now anyways, our electrical grid can't handle it. Especially if you had agencies all up and down the coast trying to do desal. Last summer alone, we had the governor basically telling everybody, don't charge your electric vehicles between whatever it was in the afternoon when it was.
Oh yeah, I remember
when it was hot out.
Yeah.
And it was only because utilities, for example, were asked to run their backup diesel generators to give some relief to the electrical grid, that we didn't have actual brownouts and blackouts during this last summer. So we just don't have the electrical grid in place right now to be able to provide the energy that's needed for desalination all up and down the coast. So that's a huge hurdle, and the cost associated with desal. So the operational costs, probably pushing north of $3,000 per acre foot. An acre foot is, think of it as a football field with 1 foot of water. That's an acre foot. So about $3,000 an acre foot to process and create desalinated water for drinking.
How does that compare to advanced purified water?
Advanced purified, so we've been, it kind of changes as
Sure.
the design's evolving. But right now we're at about $1,700 to $2,300 per acre foot.
So that's significant.
It is less.
Yeah.
It's still more than right now we pay for state water, imported water. We're paying about $1,100 or so per acre foot. Now that state water is going to get more expensive though.
Exactly.
So potable reuse is cheaper. Some estimates 20 to 50% cheaper operationally compared to desal. So it's significant.
That's very significant. And of course, we're ratepayer funded. And so that's the significant difference for our customers, right? Because we talked about how, the different funding mechanisms we have and how we're trying to use other people's money as much as possible. But once we exhaust, those avenues, we will be relying on ratepayers just like we do for our operations. And so we are prioritizing keeping these project costs as low as possible so that it affects our customers as little as possible. And so it's really helpful to know that not only are we satisfying, one particular need that we wouldn't be able to satisfy with desal with pure water, but it's also the least expensive option. So, you talked about how it's worth studying and looking into for the future. Do you think that desal will ever be the right choice for our region? And maybe when?
Certainly. Boy, that's that's a tough question. There's a place for desal. I think the timing isn't right now. We really do have to pick the lowest hanging fruit first as far as water supplies. And it is desal is more expensive. It's potentially it does have a place down the road. If I were to guess, when at least in this region, we would really have to probably pursue a regional project and partner with someone like Cayugas or United Water or all of the above to build a larger desalination plant, because the operational costs go down quite a bit for the larger plants. So building smaller plants just probably doesn't pencil out too much. So
why is that? Why do the costs go down if it's a bigger
economy of scale?
Okay.
Yeah, it's the whole concept of economy of scale. If you try to build a really small desal plant, there's just a lot of upfront costs that would be the same for a large plant, and so you just just as you when you build bigger things, that unit cost goes down, and so the solution is really probably a regional project. And gosh, if I had to guess, when I think about like some of these projects up and down the coast where they've pursued desalination, just the planning and conceptual design, preliminary design, and permitting, at least 10 years, 15 years.
Wow.
Potentially longer. There's a lot of studies that have to go into these things with regards to environmental impacts. I talked a little bit about the intake structure system, the screening. There's a lot of concern from the environmental community about what's called impingement and entrainment. So you can imagine these screens out in the ocean and fish swimming by, and the force of sucking water out of the ocean pulls these either fish larvae or juvenile fish, plankton up against the screens. And so there's always this concern about, well, you're taking a food supply away from the ecosystem. And so there's a lot of studies that have to be done to just do something like before you could put a ocean intake out there, and so and get that permitted and everything. So it's a very long road. It's possible.
A lot of yellow tape, though. It sounds
politically, there's a lot of resistance right now. It truly is a water supply of last resort. And when you look at places that have done desal, it is because they have no other choice.
Sure.
I could think, Catalina Island. I could think about like some other places in the world, like in Spain. Certainly Israel, and they are tapping into that water supply of last resort, which is desalination.
So this is a good segue, because you kind of talked about the ecological impacts of that intake of desal. Can we talk a little bit about the brine disposal?
Certainly.
Right, because that's the main byproduct with both processes. But as we mentioned, with desal, ocean desal at least, you have a way higher salinity level in that brine disposal, and you have to do something with that. And so what does brine disposal and that waste management look like with desal, and why is it such an issue?
Well, so with desal, there's going to be more brine. As I mentioned, for every 2 gallon or every gallon of drinkable water that you get from desal, you need to run 2 gallons. So you're wasting about 50%, and that goes out through a pipe that goes to a ocean outfall and into the ocean. With purified recycled water, it's just a lot. It's a lot less. It's a lot less brine that you have to handle. It's a lot less brine that you have to push back out in the ocean. Um, but both of those, the pipeline for desal would be larger diameter, bigger, to handle the larger volumes, and so that really adds up.
Sure.
I think our brine line that is on the drawing board right now is something like an 8 or 10 inch diameter, and if we did something with, if we were doing desal, it might be double that at least. So there's capital expenditures associated with that, so it increases cost. But with both of whether it's purified recycled water, pure water, or if it's desalination, the discharge to the ocean, the outfall is very similar. Just the quantity is really a lot different. In both cases, you can't just have like a pipe that goes out in the ocean and then just that brine just comes out.
Right.
It's actually, what you typically see is that the pipe is capped at the end, and then you have these like nozzles along the length of the pipe for, it could be for hundreds of feet in the ocean, where you release a little bit of brine out of each of these little nozzles that are tapped into the pipe. And the reason for that
Are
is
those the diffusers?
diffusers.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're not concentrating all that brine in one location,
Right.
which could hurt aquatic life, kelp, and again, talking about like fish larvae, juvenile fish, and other aquatic life. So you want to disperse it in a larger area so that it doesn't have as much of an impact.
Sounds like a dilution mechanism, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of studies that have been done with these outfalls. It's been studied to death, and there is a design standards to go by.
Now, are these, or is this diffuser technology as effective for the brine byproduct from the advanced purification process as it is from like ocean desal, or is it sort of more effective for advanced purified brine because it's not as salty?
Well, there's you could say there's going to be, as far as quantity of that brine, there's less of an environmental impact because there's going to be far less brine with purified recycled water.
So it's
water
less
versus
brine, and that less amount of brine is also less salty. So we're minimizing environmental impact with this byproduct and the discharge of this byproduct than we would be if it were desalinated.
With regards to like the salt and what
Right.
salt, like overly high concentrations of salt could do to aquatic life, yes.
Specifically.
Yeah.
Okay. So with our pure water project, I mean, this is set to provide up to 30% of our drinking water supply. If we were to pursue desal in the future, how much do you think water that could bring our region? Is that even like quantifiable at this point?
Well, with regards to that, we're always going to want to take advantage of what Mother Nature could give us first. That's going to be your cheaper water.
That's a good point.
There's always a concern about building too big, and then we talk a lot about having a stranded asset, where you've built something like a desal plant, and then maybe you built it during a drought, and it's great. It's providing you plenty of backup, but then when nature starts to provide again, like we had this last winter, and you're going to naturally resort to the less expensive water supply, and then you shut down that desal plant or turn the dial way down, and then you have what's called a stranded asset that's not being utilized. So it's like throwing away money almost.
Sure.
It's nice to have. It would be nice to have a desal plant, but to have it not run
would be costly.
It's you're just not you're not getting the benefit of all that investment that you made. But there, look, again, just thinking down the road, there's probably a place for desal. Again, 10, 20, 25 years out from now.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be really more of an augmentation.
Sure.
And I think Santa Barbara learned a valuable lesson. They built a desal plant back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s during that drought. And then, of course, when Mother Nature started to provide again, they basically mothballed it, sold it off,
Oh, wow.
or parts and pieces of it.
Oh,
And
wow.
of course, then we had another drought. This was a huge lesson for water agencies throughout the world. Is we had the next drought, and they wished they had that desal plant that
That's
they
crazy.
hadn't mothballed it. So,
Yeah.
so what they do now, they basically they rebuilt the plant, they recommissioned it, and
Wow.
and they now even when there is plenty of other water supplies available, either import or just local runoff, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Their standard is they will continue to run that plant at some minimum flow,
Okay.
and they could turn up the dial if they need to. And so that's another thing with using reverse osmosis is ideally you want to always have it running,
Right.
because when
you don't want those filters to dry out, right?
yeah, if you stop running the filters and passing water through it, it could clog up, and
Right.
it creates a lot of problems. But the sky is a limit. We have an unlimited supply of water out in the Pacific Ocean. We could have it provide all of our water needs, or just to help augment, and then turn that dial up and down as needed. So
But at a cost.
it is at a cost.
Right.
It's at a significant cost.
Yeah.
And I look at what what other agencies, like what their rates are, the ones that do have desal versus not desal, and it's significant. It's very significant. And I think our customers and others listening in on this podcast should realize, if your water bill is $100 a month right now, desal to your portfolio, it could easily be double, triple, $300 a month.
Wow.
So
That puts
it's
things
just
into perspective.
So really, our priority is conservation. And really, when I talk about conservation, I think more about just using water as efficiently as possible.
Yes.
Transforming those landscapes so that you're just not throwing expensive water on those landscapes. So having climate appropriate landscapes that use less water, and using what you need indoors, and not wasting that water. And then using water supplies. Again, for us right now, the low-hanging fruit is purified recycled water. And then down the road, if we want to further diversify our water supply portfolio and not be as reliant on state water, then introducing desalination, but probably on more of a regional, like a large regional plant, as opposed to just a very small plant.
Yeah, thank you. And you wrap that up really nicely. Many people don't realize this, but always, always, always on a small scale and on a larger scale, conservation and using water efficiently is going to always be the most cost-effective way to use water and manage our water resources, right? Yes, investments need to be made in storage and water recycling projects like this, and in certain cases, desal as a part of an overall portfolio. But at the end of the day, we are all going to pay less if we use less and if we conserve the water. So indeed, desal will have its place. For now, pure water is really the answer for us and certainly for our customers. And before we sign off completely, I just kind of want to get your input on this. Desalination versus desalinization. I know that they're used interchangeably, but is desalinization like the proper way to say that? I hate that term.
Desalinization. I personally don't use desalinization.
Is it a valid term? Do we know that? Is it supposed to be?
It probably is.
Tomato.
I don't know. There's
maybe some extra letters and syllables in there.
I think whatever works for you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fair. I'll leave that out there. Thank you for joining us again for this episode of the Full Circle Podcast. Joe, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise. We appreciate it. You put a lot into perspective and reminded us why we are doing pure water specifically. And in our next episodes, we will talk about the path to an operator if or anyone is interested in getting into the water industry. And we'll also get into what we call CECs. Stay tuned and we will discuss that. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Full Circle Podcast. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at LVMWD, on Instagram at Las Virgenes_MWD, and on Facebook at LVMWD. Find our Full Circle Podcast on your favorite streaming service, or go to ourpureh2o.com and smash on the Full Circle Podcast link for all other episodes.